History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2, The First Civilizations. Chapter 4, Intruders and Invaders, The Dark Ages of the Ancient Near East. A tribal religion had successfully resisted the early dangers of contamination by the fertility rites and polytheism of the agriculturalists, among whom the Hebrews had settled in Canaan. But there was always a threat of backsliding which would compromise the covenant. With success came other dangers too. A kingdom meant a court, foreign contacts, and, in Solomon's day, foreign wives who cherished the cults of their own gods. Denunciation of the evils of departing from the law by going a whoring after the fertility gods of the Philistines had been the first role of the prophets. A new luxury gave them a social theme as well. The prophets brought to its height the Israelite idea of God. They were not soothsayers such as the Near East already knew, though this was probably the tradition which formed the first two great prophets, Samuel and Elijah, but preachers, poets, political and moral critics. Their status depended essentially on the conviction they could generate in themselves and others that God spoke through them. Few preachers have had such success. In the end, Israel would be remembered not for the great deeds of her kings, but for the ethical standards announced by her prophets. They shaped the connections of religion with morality, which were to dominate not only Judaism but Christianity and Islam. The prophets evolved the cult of Yahweh into the worship of a universal God, just and merciful, stern to punish sin, but ready to welcome the sinner who repented. This was the climax of religious culture in the Near East, a point after which religion could be separated from locality and tribe. The prophets also bitterly attacked social injustice. Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah went behind the privileged priestly caste to do so, denouncing religious officialdom directly to the people. They announced that all men were equal in the sight of God, that kings might not simply do what they would, which was a given fact, independent of human authority. Thus, the preaching of adherence to a moral law, which Israel believed was God given, became also a basis for a criticism of existing political power. Since the law was not made by man, it did not ostensibly emerge from that power. The prophets could always appeal to it as well as to their divine inspiration against king or priest. It is not too much to say that if the heart of political liberalism is the belief that the power must be used within the moral framework independent of it, then its taproot is the teaching of the prophets. Most of the prophets after Samuel spoke against a troubled background, which they called in evidence as signs of backsliding and corruption. Israel had prospered in the eclipse of paramount powers when kingdoms came and went with great rapidity after Solomon's death in 935 BC. Hebrew history had ups as well as downs, but broadly took a turn for the worse. There had already been revolts, soon the kingdom split. Israel became a northern kingdom built on 10 tribes gathered together around a capital at Samaria. In the south, the tribes of Benjamin and Judah still held Jerusalem, capital of the kingdom of Judah. The Assyrians obliterated Israel in 722 BC, and the 10 tribes disappeared from history in mass deportations. Judah lasted longer. It was more compact and somewhat less in the path of great states. It survived until 587 BC, when Jerusalem's walls and temple were razed by a Babylonian army. The Judeans too then suffered deportations. many of them being carried away to Babylon, to the great experience of the exile, a period so important and formative that after it we may properly speak of the Jews, the inheritors and transmitters of a tradition still alive and easily traced. Once more, great empires had established their grip in Mesopotamia and gave its civilization its last flowering. The circumstances which had favored the appearance of a Jewish state had disappeared. Fortunately for the Jews, the religion of Judah now ensured that this did not mean that their national identity was doomed too. Since the days of Hammurabi, the peoples of the Mesopotamian valley had been squeezed in a vice of migratory peoples. For a long time, its opposing jaws had been the Hittites and the Mitanni. But from time to time, others had ruled in Assur and Babylon. When, in due course, the Hittites also crumbled, ancient Mesopotamia was the seat of no great military power until the 9th century BC. Though such a sentence conceals much. One Assyrian king briefly conquered Syria and Babylon early in the 11th century. He was soon swept away by a cluster of pushful Semitic tribes whom scholars called Arameans, followers of the old tradition of expansion into the fertile lands from the desert, together with a new line of Kassite kings in Babylon. They were the awkward and touchy neighbors of the reduced kings of Assyria for 200 years or so, for about as long as the United States has existed. Though one of these Semitic peoples was called the Chaldees and therefore subsequently gave its name, somewhat misleading, to Babylonia. There is not much to be remarked in this story except further evidence of the fragility of the political constructions of an ancient world. Shape only begins to reappear in the turmoil of events in the 9th century BC, when Mesopotamia recovered. Then the Old Testament tells us Assyrian armies were once more on the move against the Syrian and Jewish kingdoms. After some successful resistance, the Assyrians came back again and again, and they conquered. This was the beginning of a new, important, and unpleasant phase of Near Eastern history. A new Assyrian empire was in the making. In the 8th century, it was moving to its apogee, and Nineveh, the capital high up the Tigris, which had replaced the ancient center of Assur, became the focus of Mesopotamian history as Babylon had once been. Assyrian Empire was unified in a way that other great empires were not. It did not rely on the vassalization of kings and the creation of tributaries. Instead, it swept native rulers away and installed Assyrian governors. Often, too, it swept away peoples. One of its characteristic techniques was mass deportation. The 10 tribes of Israel are the best remembered victims. Assyrian expansion was carried forward by repeated and crushing victory. Its greatest successes followed 729 BC, when Babylon was seized. Soon after, Assyrian armies destroyed Israel, Egypt was invaded, its kings were confined to Upper Egypt, and the Delta was annexed. By then, Cyprus had submitted, Cilicia and Syria had been conquered. Finally, in 646 BC, Assyria made its last important conquest, part of the land of Elam, whose kings dragged the Assyrian conqueror's chariot through the streets of Nineveh. The consequences were of great importance for the whole Near East. A standardized system of government and law spanned the whole area. Conscript soldiers and deported populations were moved about within it, sapping its provincialism. Aramaic spread widely as a common language. A new cosmopolitanism was possible after the Assyrian age. This great formative power is commemorated in monuments of undeniable impressiveness. Sargon II, 721 to 705 BC, built a great palace at Khorasabad near Nineveh, which covered half a square mile of land and was embellished with more than a mile of sculpted reliefs. The profits of conquest financed a rich and splendid court. Ashurbanipal, 668 to 626 BC, also left his monuments, including obelisks, carried off to Nineveh from Thebes. But he was a man with a taste for learning and antiquities, and his finest relic is what survives of the great collection of tablets he made for his library. In it, he accumulated copies of all that he could discover of the records and literature of ancient Mesopotamia. It is to these copies that we owe much of our knowledge of Mesopotamian literature, among them the Epic of Gilgamesh in its fullest edition, a translation made from Sumerian. The ideas that moved this civilization are thus fairly accessible from literature as well as from other sources. The frequent representation of Assyrian kings as hunters may be a part of the image of the warrior king, but may also form part of a conscious identification of the king with legendary conquerors of nature who had been the heroes of a remote Sumerian past. The stone reliefs which commemorate the great deeds of Assyrian kings also repeat monotonously another tale, that of sacking, enslavement, impalement, torture, and the final solution of mass deportation. Assyrian Empire had a brutal foundation of conquest and intimidation. It was made possible by the creation of the best army up to this time, fed by conscription of all the males and armed with iron weapons. It also had siege artillery able to breach walls until this time impregnable, and even some mailed cavalry. It was a coordinated force of all arms. Perhaps, too, it had a special religious fervor. The god Ashur is shown hovering over the armies as they go to the battle, and to him kings reported their victories over unbelievers. Whatever the fundamental explanation of Assyrian success, it quickly waned. Possibly, empire put too great a strain on the Assyrian numbers. The year after Ashurbanipal died, the empire began to crumble. The first sign being a revolt in Babylon. The rebels were supported by the Chaldeans and also by a great new neighbor, the kingdom of the Medes, now the leading Iranian people. Their entrance as a major power on the stage of history marks an important change. The Medes had hitherto been distracted by having to deal with another wave of barbarian invaders from the north, the Scythians, who poured down into Iran from the Caucasus and at the same time down the Black Sea coast towards Europe. These were light cavalrymen fighting with the bow from horseback, and the first major eruption into Western Asia of a new force in world history, nomadic people straight from Central Asia. It took time to come to terms with them in the 7th century. Like all other great invasions, the Scythian advance pushed other peoples before them. The kingdom of Phrygia was overrun by one of these. Meanwhile, the last of the political units of the Near East based on the original Caucasian inhabitants was gobbled up by Scythes, Medes, or Assyrians. All this took a century or more, but amounted to a great clearing of the stage. The instability and fragmentation of the periphery of the Fertile Crescent had long favored Assyria. It ceased to do so when Scythes and Medes joined forces. This pushed Assyria over the edge and gave the Babylonians independence again. Assyria passes from history with the sack of Nineveh by the Medes in 612 BC. This thunderbolt was not quite the end of Mesopotamian tradition. Assyria's collapse left the Fertile Crescent open to new masters. The north was seized by the Medes, who pushed across Anatolia until halted at the borders of Lydia, and at last drove the Scythes back into Russia. An Egyptian pharaoh made a grab at the south and the Levant, but was defeated by a Babylonian king. Nebuchadnezzar, who gave Mesopotamian civilization an Indian summer of grandeur and at last Babylonian empire, which more than any other captured the imagination of posterity. It ran from Suez, the Red Sea, and Syria across the border of Mesopotamia and the old kingdom of Elam, by then ruled by a minor Iranian dynasty called the Achaemenids. If for nothing else, Nebuchadnezzar would be remembered as the great conqueror who destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC after a Jewish revolt and carried off the tribes of Judah into captivity, using them as he used other captives to carry out the embellishment of his capital, whose hanging gardens or terraces were to be remembered as one of the seven wonders of the world. He was the greatest king of his time, perhaps of any time until his own. The glory of the empire came to a focus in the cult of Marduk, which was now at its zenith. At a great New Year festival held each year, all the Mesopotamian gods, the idols and statues of provincial shrines, came down the rivers and canals to take counsel with Marduk at his temple and acknowledged his supremacy. Borne down a processional way 3/4 of a mile long, which was, we are told, probably the most magnificent street of antiquity, or landed from the Euphrates nearer to the temple, they were taken into the presence of a statue of the god, which Herodotus reported 2 centuries later was made of 2¼ tons of gold. No doubt he exaggerated, but it was indisputably magnificent. The destinies of the whole world, whose center was this temple, were then debated by the gods and determined for another year. Thus, theology reflected political reality. The reenacting of the drama of creation was the endorsement of Marduk's eternal authority, and this was an endorsement of the absolute monarchy of Babylon. The king had a responsibility for assuring the order of the world and therefore the authority to do so. It was the last flowering of the Mesopotamian tradition and was soon to end. More and more provinces were lost under Nebuchadnezzar's successors. Then came an invasion in 539 BC by new conquerors from the east, the Persians, led by the Achaemenids. The passage from worldly pomp and splendor to destruction had been swift. The book of Daniel telescopes it in a magnificent closing scene. Belshazzar's feast. Night, we read, was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom. Daniel 5:30-31. Unfortunately, this account was written only 300 years later, and it was not quite like that. Belshazzar was neither Nebuchadnezzar's son nor his successor, as the book of Daniel says, and the king who took Babylon was called Cyrus. Nonetheless, the emphasis of the Jewish tradition has a dramatic and psychological truth. Insofar as the story of antiquity has a turning point, this is it. An independent Mesopotamian tradition going back to Sumer was over. We are at the edge of a new world. A Jewish poet summed it up exultantly in the book of Isaiah, where Cyrus appears as a deliverer to the Jews. Sit thou silent and get thee into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms. Isaiah 47 5. Chapter 5. The Beginnings of Civilization in Eastern Asia. From the beginnings to the most recent times, the center of gravity of world history has usually swung about between the Atlantic and Iran. Yet, also, until the most recent times, what went on there had little direct impact elsewhere. Much of the life of other parts of the world long remained virtually impervious to the influence of its civilizations, and the two areas were specially resistant India and China. By 1000 BC, civilizations had appeared in these countries which were, in spite of peripheral contracts, quite independent of the Near East. They were the foundations of major and enduring cultures and traditions long to outlive those of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and they would each enjoy a huge sphere of influence. Ancient India. Even now, ancient India is still visible and accessible to us in a very direct sense. At the beginning of this country, some Indian communities still lived as all our primeval ancestors must once have lived by hunting and gathering. The bullock cart and the potter's wheel of the many villages today are, as far as can be seen, much the same as those used 4,000 years ago. A caste system whose main lines were set by about 1000 BC still regulates the lives of millions and even of some Indian Christians and Muslims. Gods and goddesses whose cults can be traced to the Stone Age are still worshipped at village shrines. In some ways, then, ancient India is, with us, still as is no other ancient civilization. Yet, though such examples of the conservatism of Indian life are commonplace, the country that contains them contains many other things too. The hunter gatherers of the early 20th century were the contemporaries of other Indians used to traveling in railway trains. The diversity of Indian life is enormous, but wholly comprehensible given the size and variety of its setting. The subcontinent is, after all, about the size of Europe and is divided into regions clearly distinguished by climate, terrain, and crops. There are two great river valleys, the Indus and the Ganges systems. In the north, between them lie desert and arid plains, and to the south, the highlands of the Deccan, largely forested. When written history begins, India's racial complexity too is already very great. Scholars identify six main ethnic groups. Many others were to arrive later and make themselves at home in the Indian subcontinent and society too. All this makes it hard to find a focus. Yet, Indian history has a unity in the fact of its enormous power to absorb and transform forces playing on it from the outside. This provides a thread to guide us through the patchy and uncertain illumination of its early stages, which is provided by archaeology and texts long transmitted only by word of mouth. Its basis is to be found in another fact. India's large measure of insulation from the outside world by geography. In spite of her size and variety, until the oceans began to be opened up in the 16th and 17th centuries, India had only to grapple with occasional, though often irresistible, incursions by alien peoples. To the north and northwest, she was protected by some of the highest mountains in the world. To the east lay belts of jungles, the other two sides of the subcontinent's great triangle opened into huge expanses of the Indian Ocean. This natural definition not only channeled with restricted communication with the outside world, it also gave India a distinctive climate. Much of India does not lie in the tropics, but nonetheless, the climate is tropical. The mountains keep away the icy winds of Central Asia. The long coasts open themselves to the rain laden clouds which roll in from the oceans and cannot go beyond the northern ranges. The climactic clock is the annual monsoon, bringing the rain during the hottest months of the year. It is still the central prop of the agricultural economy. Protected in some measure from external forces, though she has always been before modern times. India's northwestern frontier is more open than her others to the outside world. Balochistan and the frontier passes were the most important zones of encounter between India and other peoples, right down to the 17th century AD. In civilized times, even India's contacts with China were first made by this roundabout route, though it is not quite as roundabout as Mercator's familiar projection makes it appear. At times, this northwestern region has fallen directly under foreign sway, which is suggestive when we consider the first Indian civilizations. We do not know much about the way in which they arose, but we know that Sumer and Egypt antedated it. Mesopotamian records of Sargon I of Akkad report contacts with the Aluha, which scholars have believed to be the Indus Valley, the alluvial plains forming the first natural region encountered by the traveler once he has entered India. It was there, in rich, heavily forested countryside, that the first Indian civilizations appeared at the time when, farther west, the great movements of Indo European peoples were beginning to act as the levers of history. There may have been more than one stimulus at work. The evidence also shows that agriculture came later to India, then to Near East. It too can first be traced in the subcontinent in its northwest corner. There is archaeological evidence of domesticated animals in Balochistan as far back as 3700 BC. By 3000 BC, there are signs of settled life on the alluvial plains and parallels with other river valley cultures begin to appear. Wheel thrown pottery and copper implements begin to be found. All the signs are of a gradual built up in intensity of agricultural settlements until true civilization appears as it did in Egypt and Sumer. But there is a possibility of direct Mesopotamian influence in the background. And finally, there is at least a reasonable inference that already India's future was being shaped by the coming of the new peoples from the north. At a very clear early date, the complex racial composition of India's population suggests this, though it would be rash to be assertive about it. When at last indisputable evidence of civilized life is available, the change is startling. One scholar speaks of a cultural explosion. There may have been one crucial technological step, the invention of burnt brick, as opposed to the sun baked mud brick of Mesopotamia, which made flood control possible in flat plain lacking natural stone. Whatever the process, the outcome was a remarkable civilization which stretched over 500,000 square miles of the Indus Valley, an area greater than either the Sumerian or Egypt.